Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the webinar series hosted by European Movement UK. And this webinar is entitled What Next for the UK-EU Energy, Climate and Environment Cooperation. You will be really pleased to hear that we have two wonderful guests today to help launch the campaign here at European Movement. And hopefully from this webinar, you'll get to hear why we need a UK-EU partnership on energy, climate and the environment, opportunities to deepen the relationship and build a more ambitious agenda, the practical steps that you can do to advance joint action on energy transition, climate change and the environmental protection that we desperately need, and how you can get involved in that campaign. So just a couple of housekeeping exercises before I bring in our wonderful speakers. Firstly, this webinar series will only be successful if you get involved. So you will see on the side of your screens, the comment section. Please make sure you get your questions for our speakers in as early as humanly possible. So you should be able to do that. We'll be going to Q&A maybe around 7 o'clock, just before 7 o'clock if everything goes well. So please make sure that you do that. And just to let you know that our webinars will also be recorded so that people can watch back the question and answers and the speeches from our speakers. So with no further ado, I think it's really important that we talk about what everyone is here to see, which is to discuss our new campaign that launched yesterday. And we are joined by the former leader of the Green Party of England and Wales, former member of Parliament. But actually, I think everyone on this webinar will know her best, of course, as the co-president of the European Movement UK, Caroline Lucas. Caroline, over to you.
Thank you so much, Richard, for that kind introduction. And thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening. I think this is a really exciting moment. As you just heard from Richard, this is the membership launch of our new report, a new agenda for UK-EU energy, climate and environment cooperation. It went live yesterday with a launch in London with a really well-attended panel discussion, and that involved Amber Rudd, the former Secretary of State, Sarah Williams from Green Alliance, Dara Vyas from Energy UK, and Emilian Gask, who's with the EU delegation to the UK. And we're hoping to get some national press at the weekend as well. And there was a real sense, I think, in the room last night that people really welcomed the fact that the European movement now is getting more involved with a focus on climate and environment. And we know that rebuilding the UK's relationship with the EU must be grounded not only in shared history, but in shared purpose. And I would argue that nowhere is that clearer than how we respond to the defining challenge of our age, which is protecting the environment, restoring the natural world, and securing a livable future, one that's cleaner, fairer, and fit for future generations. And that's what tonight is about. And that's why I'm so pleased to be here as we launch this new campaign and this important new report. Because let's be honest, since the UK left the EU, we have seen mounting evidence of costly and damaging divergence, whether that's in chemical safety, in air and water pollution, and in our capacity to respond to climate breakdown. And in some cases, the consequences are already being felt in the food that we eat, the protection of our environment, the energy bills that households are struggling to pay. And so I think a key message is that the arguments we make in this report isn't something abstract. It's personal, it's political, and it's urgent. So just to give you a few examples, take chemical regulation, for example. That was something that I worked on when I was an MEP, a member of the European Parliament, and the EU REACH scheme was this kind of groundbreaking system to protect health and the environment from chemical pollution. Now, the UK rather, has now formally diverged from the EU REACH system, and we have no access at all to the European Chemicals Agency and all of the data that holds. And that means there's more cost, more duplication, and less certainty for British businesses. And it's been estimated that compliance costs alone are expected to exceed £2 billion. And that's before considering the lost opportunities for scientific cooperation, cross-border enforcement, or real-time data sharing on dangerous substances. And what have we made that decision for? For less safety, less transparency, and fewer tools to protect public health. Or take pesticides. We now allow pesticides in the UK that the EU has banned, including, for example, glyphosate. That's classified by the World Health Organization as a probable human carcinogen. And yet it's been found in beans, for example, at levels 7.5 times higher in the UK than in the EU. And I'd argue that is a deeply worrying indictment of the path that we are now on, and a stark warning of the human cost of going it alone, essentially. Or take electricity. Now, since we no longer participate in the EU's integrated system, our electricity trading is slower, it's less efficient, it's more expensive. Now, fragmented cross-border auctions are estimated to cost UK consumers and businesses between 120 and 370 million pounds every year. And that's real money coming straight off energy bills at a time when people can least afford it. And unless our carbon markets are linked, UK exports will soon face tariffs under the EU's new carbon border adjustment mechanism. And the costs from that are projected to exceed £800 million by 2030. Energy UK has estimated that divergence alone on energy could cost this country up to £10 billion during this Parliament alone. That's through higher prices, reduced investment, and missed opportunities. So you might just have thought that a government that was so concerned about how to fill any number of growing black holes would be very interested in this agenda, because we seem to be throwing money down the tubes without any real consideration about the fact that that is a total waste of money. And it's also not in our own interests, in the interests of health, in the interests of the environment. And those few examples that I've given you could be replicated many times over. And one of the areas that I feel passionate about actually is the European Environment Agency. You know, why aren't we part of that extraordinary organization that we helped to found, which would allow us to share really vital scientific data about the state of the environment in the UK and the EU? You know, other countries that aren't even members of the EU are part of the European Environment Agency. It is really just bizarre that we are not. And so what I would argue is that what we're seeing is not strategic autonomy, as we were told Brexit would deliver. What we're talking about here is strategic self-harm. Because meanwhile, the EU is moving forward with, for example, a new nature restoration law, which will restore 20% of degraded ecosystems by 2030. They are banning dozens of harmful chemicals and pesticides. They've been doing that since 2020. We've not been keeping up. The European climate law enshrines net zero targets in binding legislation backed by a Green Deal that supports industry, workers, and regions. And we're not doing that either. And yes, of course, look, I'm not looking at the EU with rose-tinted glasses. I know that there are very real populist political pressures across Europe too. We are seeing pushback from vested interests. We are seeing real concerns about how to deliver the transition fairly. But the direction of travel is clear, and there is a plan, and there is a structure, and there's an effort to bring people with it. And also, frankly, the fact that there is a pushback in parts of Europe makes it even more important that the UK develops stronger ties, because we can play a really helpful role in pushing for greater ambition. Because we just need to remind ourselves that when we were members of the EU, the UK was often a leader, not a follower, on climate and environment. And that history and that influence and that expertise should not go to waste. But let me be clear, this report and this campaign are not about looking backwards. They're about what we can build together now. Because the climate crisis, the crisis of nature, the energy crisis are not separate challenges. They are deeply interconnected. And they demand a joined up response, one that crosses borders, one that crosses sectors, one that crosses party lines. And that is what this proposed UK-EU Energy, Climate and Environment Partnership is all about. Because it would help cut emissions, it would help restore nature and biodiversity, it would lower household energy bills, and crucially, it would ensure that the UK has a seat at the table when vital decisions are being made, for example, in developing the North Sea. It would raise protections on water quality, air pollution, harmful chemicals, and it would rebuild trust in the rules and the institutions that safeguard public health. And it would reconnect the UK with those vital scientific and regulatory networks that I mentioned, from the European Environment Agency to the LIFE funding programme. Now, it may be that some might say, well, this is all very nice, but it's unrealistic, that the politics won't allow it. But you know what? We've already seen what is possible when the political will is there. Think of the UK-EU Security and Defence Partnership. That was agreed in May, and it proves that structured cooperation can be built even when we're outside of the EU. And the Commission already has so-called green alliances with countries like Canada, Japan, and South Korea. And I'd argue as well that the political context here at home is shifting. There's now clear public majority support for re-engagement. 71% of UK voters would support a formal UK-EU partnership if it reduces energy bills and harmful chemicals, even if it meant applying some EU rules. And over 2/3 say the UK should work with other countries to prevent environmental damage and tackle climate change. So in summary, this is the time to act. We need leadership, the kind that puts future generations ahead of short-term headlines. So I really welcome this report's practical proposals. But I just want to end by saying that this campaign isn't just about policy. Obviously, it's about people too. It's about showing that the UK can be part of something bigger again, a community of values and action, that we can take responsibility, not just for the emissions we produce, but for the ecosystems we share, that we can rebuild trust and influence in Europe, not through kind of world-beating bluster, but through cooperation, through humility, and through ambition. Because the truth is, as I said, Britain did help to shape many of these policies to begin with. We were leaders in designing EU climate rules, habitat protections, emission trading systems. Our legacy is in the DNA of the Green Deal, and it should be in its future too. And this campaign reminds us that civil society matters too, that action doesn't only happen in conference rooms or around negotiating tables, but in the voices of people who stand up to say, we want better, we deserve better, and we're ready to work for it. So I just want to thank everyone here, thank the European movement and people across the country who care deeply about these issues. Let's make this partnership a reality. Let's restore ambition. Let's restore cooperation. Let's restore hope. Because if we are serious about our responsibilities to nature, to future generations, to our place in the world, then I'd argue that partnership isn't optional, it's essential, and we have to begin now.
Thank you so much, Caroline. So much there to reflect on, and so eloquently put. I think one of the key points there that you made there is that, this is an economic issue. This is a health issue. These, they are two of the top issues that everyone says in polling in the UK every time when they're asked what their top 5 issues are. The economy and health and climate change are always in that top 5. And actually, we have to realise that it's an interchangeable policy area, and it's what people actually care about. You mentioned that rebuilding the EU relationship is important, but actually we need those next practical steps. You mentioned the defence and security partnership. It means that there is a wealth of other areas, including the environment, including climate change, where we can work together with our neighbours. It makes geographic sense, it makes political sense, and we need to make sure that the climate breakdown is part of that negotiation. And one of my main questions you've actually already answered is, what is the UK's heritage in this area? And you said it, we have something. We don't have to look backwards at Brexit and bring up some of the old debates that we had almost 10 years ago, but we can be proud of our heritage, and that's so important. So thinking about not being in the abstract, that last point that you made, making it about people, it's such an important point. There are practical things that we must do, and practical things that have been so very well set out in our report that was launched yesterday. And I want to bring in now Simon Saunders, our political communications and engagement manager and author of the report, A New Agenda for UK EU Energy, Climate and Environment Cooperation, to talk about those practical steps in policy that we can build on. So over to you, Simon.
Thanks, Richard. I think, as Caroline mentioned, I think you did as well, on Wednesday we published a a new report on the future of UK-EU cooperation on energy and climate. And what I want to do now is just walk you through that report, not just the vision it sets out, but the practical step-by-step plan it proposes. As was mentioned, this is about cleaner energy, cheaper bills, stronger environmental protections, and a seat at the table for the UK. So we call it a UK-EU energy, climate, and environment partnership, and it's built around 4 pillars. And I'm just going to quickly run through each of those now. So first, we propose the UK and the EU to link their carbon pricing systems, and this is known as emissions trading schemes. Essentially, this is a tool that sets a cap on emissions and allows companies to buy and sell allowances, creating a market incentive to cut pollution. And at the moment, we both run separate systems. And because they're not connected, UK exports of things like steel and cement will soon face extra charges at the EU border under something called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM. But by linking the systems, which both sides agreed to explore at the summit in May, would avoid these charges. It would also create a more stable carbon market and support clean investment. CBAM is due to come into force the 1st of January next year, so that's an obvious date to try and have an agreement in place, or at least an interim agreement while the details are being finalised. And in the report, we also suggest UK creates something similar to the EU Social Climate Fund. And what this does, essentially, it uses money raised from emissions trading to help households and more vulnerable groups with the costs of switching to clean energy. So the second pillar, the second part, is about planning and building an energy system for the future. Since leaving the EU, the UK no longer takes part in the EU's internal electricity market, and the impact has been real. We used to trade electricity with Europe through a single efficient system. Now trading is more fragmented and less efficient, and as Caroline mentioned, it's costing up 370 million a year, and that's extra costs passed on to homes and businesses. So by rejoining that market, it would cut that waste and help bring bills down. And significantly, it would also unlock a much better cooperation on offshore wind in the North Sea. So right now, the UK is only an observer in the North Seas Energy Corporation, and that's the group that plans shared cables, interconnectors, and wind farms. But we're Europe's leader in offshore wind, and we should be shaping those decisions rather than watching from the sidelines. So the third pillar is about protecting people and nature by aligning with EU rules where they are stronger than ours. I think Caroline mentioned a few, but since we've left the European Union, the UK has fallen behind in several areas. Mentioned all the harmful pesticides already, but others, the EU is tightening air pollution rules. The UK's deadlines are weaker and slower. The EU has introduced new laws on batteries, packaging, and eco design. The UK hasn't kept up. And we mentioned the EU's got a nature restoration regulation, whereas the UK's got no binding equivalent, and the current targets under the Environment Act are already off track. And by choosing to align with EU regulations, where they're higher than UK standards, it's not about Brussels telling us what to do. It's about choosing to follow stronger protections when they're based on science, when they benefit health, and when they make life better for people. It's also about helping British businesses, because the more our rules diverge, the harder and more expensive it becomes to export to the EU. And alignment doesn't mean giving up control. It just means being smart and choosing better rules when they're available to us. So just very briefly, the fourth pillar, it's about reconnecting with European programs that support science, regulation, and funding. Caroline already mentioned the European Environment Agency. That's the EU's environmental data hub. It brings together information on air quality, nature, pollution, climate risks, and helps countries track progress. The UK used to be a major contributor. We're now out of that and falling behind. And likewise, EANET, and that's the expert network that supports the EEA, made up of national scientists and agencies. We're no longer a part of that. And also there's the EU's LIFE programme, and that's its sort of flagship environmental fund. It's provided over 7 billion euros for nature, biodiversity, and climate projects, including over 350 million to the UK before we left. From peatland restoration in Scotland, species protection in Wales, floodplain recovery in England. We've now lost access, and there's no UK replacement. This is which you mentioned before, the European Chemicals Agency, that runs the world's most advanced system for chemical safety. But the UK no longer has access to the data, which means more duplications, higher costs, and weaker oversight of dangerous substances. These are tools that we help create, and we should use them again. And for many of these programs I've just mentioned, other third countries take part, so there's no reason why we can't as well. So that's basically a quick summary of the 4 pillars. And I think together they do form a serious deliverable plan. Collectively, as we said, they would lower energy bills, speed up climate action, raise environmental standards, reopen funding streams, and reconnect the UK with the science and networks we need to do all of this well. So yeah, that's a very quick summary, but happy to answer any questions people may have after.
Thanks very much, Simon. I think it's really important that those practical points explained so well there, and the importance of why an organisation like the European Movement has to be leading the campaign at such a level, because obviously we have a role not just as internationalists, not just as an organisation that wants to reverse the calamity of Brexit, but also we have to provide a positive vision to policymakers and to government of how to achieve those aims. It's really, really important that we do that. So how can you, listening here, get involved? So as Simon has mentioned, we've launched the campaign. We launched the campaign today. You can sign and share the petition. You will see at the bottom of your screens a rolling banner on how to do that. You can visit www.europeanmovement.co.uk/1_earth_1_team. And I think that's the real message here. It's one Earth, one team. You can eventually we'll be launching our Right to MP Ask, making sure that it is right in the inboxes of members of Parliament, getting on their nerves. I'm sure, Caroline, you'll remember all of those days when you come in and there's hundreds upon thousands of emails about lots of different issues, but it forces them to think what their position is. It forces their political party to think what their position is. And if we provide a new take, asking new policy questions at that EU level, it will force a response from the government. And that's such an important thing to do. You'll be able to join the new WhatsApp group for the campaign, making sure that we keep you up to date. You'll see a QR code on your screen. Please take time to scan that to join that WhatsApp group. There will be action days coming down the line. It will be how we communicate to you on an almost daily basis about what we're doing behind the scenes, but also what's coming and what's available for you in your groups and how you can get involved in your areas. So we will come back to that at the end of the webinar if you don't have time to scan it now. But one of the themes that's come from both our speakers is trying to make sure that our message comes to normal people, everyday people who don't necessarily think about this sort of thing every day. And in my role as campaign manager here at European Movement, I often have to sometimes get on people's nerves, I'll be honest, by trying to provide as much insight as possible into how the British public are thinking on certain issues. And before we produce this report, Simon asked me to go out into the field and produce some polling with our partners' opinion on how a European cooperation agreement, partnership, pact, language is important, is what I would say, how that would go down to with the general public. And I have a few sides for it, if just to maybe to whet the appetites of our speakers and to get the debate rolling. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. So our top learning. I'll be honest, I was a little bit shocked. I expected climate change to be up there on the agenda. I didn't expect it to be quite where it is. As Caroline mentioned, I often think that climate change gets lost in people's economic concerns, people's health concerns, and we have to often make the case. But actually, climate change is one of the top issues facing the UK when people are very specifically asked what they think about the next 10 years. So that's quite an important time frame for people. It makes people think, when people think about where they're going to be, they think about the next 10 years. It's a time frame that they have an emotional connection to. And I think that's a really important top learning. Energy cost anxiety is still very, very real. It's not necessarily in the headlines every single day, but when we take part in focus groups, when we put polling out into the field, it is very, very much still there. And I'll go into that a little bit more detail in a second. And this concern is shared by all political parties. It's actually the only subsection of anxiety in this country that brings together Reform, Labour, Conservative, Lib Dem and Green voters. And it's because it's not a party political issue. It's a real issue that everyone faces every single day. Cost is a concern to young voters. I think often people consider maybe that the cost and the economic impact of energy bills is something that specifically for an older generation, but actually 18 to 49-year-olds are much more concerned about energy costs than 50 plus. When we try to understand that in a deeper way, I think it's probably because of the multiple different pressures on the family budget, and we can say with confidence that it's an issue that will speak to families, to young people, and people who earn less in the economy as well. And I think we can be bold in our messaging. A majority of Leave voters and a majority in all age groups support the need to work with other countries to tackle climate change. And that's a really interesting point. A majority of Leave voters. And I think we need to drop sometimes the label of Leave and Remain voters, but it is unfortunately still a division that polling companies like to place on their results. And it is an insightful thing that Leave voters are willing to work with other nations. I think that is something that has moved in the last few years. And environmental damage and highlighting the impacts of floods, wildfires, coastal erosion, the loss of habitat has a big impact on current Reform voters. It moves that group of people. So we have to think about how we present the issue, what images that we use, the language that we use is really important in that. And there are push and pull factors in polling, either pulling people to us or pushing them away. And if we just go on to the next slide, I can talk about moving the dial. So we asked people a control question: to what extent, if at all, do you support or oppose the UK working with other nations to tackle climate change or help prevent environmental damage? What we tried to do there is test climate change and then test environmental damage. And as you can see, there's a clear majority to support the UK working with other nations to do that. Interestingly, there is very little difference between using climate change and environmental damage. Actually, people are fine with the term climate change. Don't let our opponents weaponize the word climate change. We can use it. We asked another control: to what extent, if at all, would you support or oppose the UK entering into a UK-EU energy and climate pact? And this was followed by quite a long explanation as to what that would mean. It would mean taking on EU laws. It would mean in the current situation, unfortunately, we wouldn't be setting those laws. We would love to see a situation in the future where that is the case. But often polling companies don't explain that situation. And we were very clear that we wanted that explanation to be very, very mindful when people answered the question. And as you can see, when we asked that control question, 41% supported, 22% opposed. Interestingly, 20% of Reform UK voters supported the control question. And then again, we need to question our biases when it comes to that. However, we then asked a series of pull factors. We asked them, if it meant the following, would you support a UK-EU energy and climate pact? And as you can see, it was an enormous change. As Caroline mentioned, reducing monthly energy bills 71%, improving protections that reduce the use of chemicals that cause cancer 70%, reduce sewage in rivers and waterways 70%, protecting wildlife and nature 69%. Interestingly, within the Reform subgroup, that was a very high percentage, reducing pesticides in food and improving flood defences and reduce coastal erosion. There are a lot of pull factors for us. What were the push factors? Well, yeah, we have to accept that taking EU laws and the way that we present that and the way that we explain that is really important. It's certainly a weakness for us. And the implications on energy bills. We know that if there's a situation where temporarily it could increase energy bills, there is something that we need to address there. And then finally, moving on to the next slide. Reform UK. It's really important that we talk about it as a subgroup. It does exist, but I think it's a much more complex picture than people are willing to accept. 48% of Reform voters would support taking EU laws if it meant it helped tackle climate change issues, which means that 50% of Reform voters accept that it is an issue. And only 5% of Reform voters don't think that climate change needs tackling. And I think, again, that's sometimes our own biases that really need to be checked. So reducing energy bills, reducing chemicals that cause cancer, reducing sewage and protecting wildlife were the top 4 pull factors within that voting group, which is really interesting. So if I could just bring our speakers back in, and a reminder that you have the comment section if you want to ask your own Q&A. We'll be going to those very shortly. But to Caroline first, having looked at the very top line of that polling, and I apologize how quick I had to go through that. So I know that you've seen the data. How important is it that we make sure that when we communicate our message, that when we explain the benefits of the UK-EU partnership, How important is it that we keep the public's perception in mind?
I think it's really important, and we need to start where the public is at, and have some confidence, as you suggest. Looking at those figures suggests that this is potentially a message that can land well. I think what we need to do is to make sure that we are communicating in really simple terms, and that goes even as basically as never just talking about net zero on its own. You would be surprised perhaps by the number of people that still don't really understand what net zero means. And actually, it's that phrase net zero that reform is really trying to weaponize. And there's been some really interesting research that's being done on the number of times in the right wing press net zero is used on its own, not linked to the idea of climate change. So it just becomes this thing that is being imposed upon you, and it isn't linked to an understanding that what this means is you're going to be less likely to flood and you're going to have fewer extreme weather events and so on and so forth. So I think that this polling just reminds us that there's all to play for, but we need to be very, very clear and simple in the language we use to communicate it. And although there's quite a lot of technical stuff in this report, just to reassure people that when you look at the landing page, when you look at the petition, that is all written in really accessible language, I think, and that is what we have to do, and really demonstrate that the agenda that we're talking about here isn't an ideological one. It's one about improving people's lives now. I came across this wonderful statistic the other day that Richard Tice's constituency is the second most prone to flooding. I'm not sure if it was in England or in the UK, but one or the other. And I just have this image in my mind of his constituents in their welly boots, standing outside his constituency office. Let's hope he's there, not, buggered off to the Bahamas or something. And they will be angry, and they will rightly be angry if he really goes ahead with the kinds of things he's been talking about. So a practical difference in people's everyday lives in a beneficial way is what this is about.
Brilliant. Yeah, absolutely. And Simon, when we discussed the report, I think the cost of energy was a really key thing that we were trying to think about. And it was very clear in the polling that that's very much the thing that come out, right? So if we could prove that there is a route to cheaper energy bills, then that is the one thing that speaks across all segments of the polling. How difficult is it to put forward, to look into these policy suggestions, keeping it real to the British public, but also relaying some of the concerns that might be around energy and the cost of energy in monthly bills?
Can you hear me? Yeah, thank you, Richard. I think, as you say, it's lowering energy bills is a crucial factor, or a key part of this. And what's been brought out, particularly at the panel yesterday and today, it's that energy, climate, and the environment, they're all interlinked. They're all they cannot or do not operate in isolation. So it might be that energy bill is a household's top priority, but actually that's linked to climate change. And I think I think we need to make the case that these are all mutually reinforcing things together, and explaining by working together on climate change, you will get the benefits for families. You will lower the energy bills.
Yeah, and I think often there's always that concern, isn't there, that actually in the short term there might be an increase, but actually if you look at Europe as leaders in this world, there is budget options, there is political choices that can be made to help with that transition, and that's a really key important aspect to address that. So if we move to some of the questions that's come through the comment section, what I'll try and do is put them to both of you. Feel free if you want to come in, feel free if you'd rather pass it on. So the first one is from Chris Coleman. Chris is from Fareham. How do the panel see the balance between more housing and wildlife in this very wildlife depleted country? Caroline, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I think there are so many issues that are packed together in the whole kind of interface between housing and the environment and wildlife. And so many of the solutions to a very genuine housing crisis is not about bulldozing yet more of the natural world. And I'm talking about things like, what we need is affordable housing, council housing, What we need is, councils to properly fund that, which in turn means the government needs to properly fund that. And it also means that we need to put real pressure on developers to actually get building on those areas of land that they already have permission to do. So there's already permission in the system for about 1.2 million homes, but builders are not bringing it forward because they are deeming that if they hang on a bit, the economics might be even more in their interest to do that. So there need to be real sanctions to stop people's just sitting on those permissions to build, but not actually using them. I think that trying to relate that question to the broader issues of the report and to the EU, I think one of the things that really worries me about the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, which is currently going through Parliament, is that the government is planning to drive a coach and horses through things like the habitats regulation and those kinds of protections that we're used to having in this country. And not only that, but they're coming up with, basically it's been called cash to trash. And basically it's about saying that, that builders and developers can kind of trash the environment if they pay for a bit of environment somewhere else in another part of the country. It doesn't even have to be in the same county to be protected instead. There are so many flaws in that whole system that is being proposed. It's all about this government's obsession at the minute with deregulation at any cost. And I just think that the environmental groups need to work even more closely together. They are working closely together to really trying to challenge the kind of fundamental tenets of that planning and infrastructure bill. But what I'm hoping is that because the European movement now has got a credible kind of stake in this argument, it's something that we can also bring our influence to bear on when it comes to lobbying MPs and so forth. And we can just remind people about the fact that in Europe, we had a system that, flawed in some ways, but nonetheless, it was actually the crown jewels when it came to protecting some of our most precious habitat.
Yes, absolutely. And Simon, the report is just the start, right? So I'm sure many people in the chat will highlight some very important issues that as an organisation we need to look at how, from an EU perspective, those issues can be dealt with. But do you have anything to add on this? Is there something that you want to talk about in terms of how the report specifically deals with wildlife, possibly the European Environment Agency?
Yeah, I know. So just briefly speaking more to the environment first. The UK does have the 30 by 30 nature directive where we're trying to preserve or restore wildlife. We've been off track and we're not doing it. We are trying to designate 30% of land for that. But just more broadly, I think it's about choosing one or the other in terms of housing or wildlife. I think the EU's nature restoration law is a good example. It sets legally binding targets, but also builds in flexibility to support urban development and infrastructure. So it's make sure we are building, but doing it in the right way.
And it's about. Sorry, Caroline, go ahead.
No, sorry, I'm just looking at the comments down there, and just to the YouTube user who says that sounds NIMBY. I genuinely don't think it does sound NIMBY. I think what we need to understand is that so much of the developers' rhetoric right now is about building expensive houses that get the biggest profits for them. Why are they sitting on so many planning permissions that are already granted, and yet still they're saying that they want more before they even start building those? I want to see them building those now, and I want them to be council housing, genuinely council housing, not social housing, which is still at around 80% of market rent. We need it to be genuinely affordable, and we needed it to be now. And I really think the environment movement as a whole must not allow itself to be kind of pigeonholed as being NIMBY, because we are not. We are talking about the right houses at the right price in the right place, and I think that is the way forward.
Absolutely. And I think, we need to learn from the Section 106 situation, right? Every community deserves to have a wildlife, deserves to have natural habitat. And we need to play our part in advocating for other organisations that work alongside us in this area. So if we go to the next question. It's from Liz Mills, who's got a few questions apparently, but we'll stick with this one. In making the case for energy, climate and environmental cooperation, why no mention of continued collaboration by UK, local and regional governments with EU counterparts? Simon, do you want to start with that one?
No, thank you. That's a very good point. This was the launch of our campaign. This was our first outing. It's a short report. I think it's only about 20 pages long, so we haven't been able to include the depth across all the issues. But I think that's actually a very good point, and I think something that we should look into further down the line.
Yeah, before we bring in Caroline, you know, regional governments, obviously some have either not just Scotland and Wales, which we, as Simon and the public affairs team, have really good relations with. It will certainly be an area that we build on. There are also devolved English city regions. I come from Manchester. I can tell you that there is an agenda that's really important and an agenda that we need to influence, and we need to do that. Over to you, Caroline.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Simon. I mean, it's clearly it's an important point. I guess I would say that I think when we come to talking about what local European movement groups can do in their own locality, then knowing about what collaborations are already happening in your own locality is going to be really important, because that's a way of making this relationship with EU counterparts real and tangible, and hopefully being able to demonstrate the benefits of it. So I think when we get to the point of the agenda where we're really saying this isn't just about a top-down report that will just sit on policy makers' shelves, this is actually about really invigorating a grassroots campaign, then all of those questions about local engagement with local government, regional government, hopefully will absolutely come to the floor.
But thanks very much, Liz, for making that point, because I think, you know, people's politics is very much local, people's communities are very much local, and it is ultimately how we'll influence people beyond party lines as well. Next question, please. So from Sarah Page. Question: will reform anti-clean energy affect much needed development being encouraged by the present UK government? Caroline?
I really want to be upbeat and positive, but yes, I mean, it was really interesting that the news came in when we were on that panel last night, launching the report to the general public, and literally Dara Vyas, who is the CEO, the Chief Executive of Energy UK, which is all of the different energy companies, was saying that even by Richard Tice sending that letter that you might have heard that he's done, he sent letters to all of the renewable energy companies saying that if you get involved in the next round of renewable energy contracts, you do it at your own risk, because reform isn't going to uphold them if they become the next government. Even by sending that letter, before they even get into power, if they do, they have already driven up the price of energy, because they're all, you know, now energy companies are going to be trying to factor that in when they make the decisions that they make about bidding for renewable energy contracts. So Richard Tice has single-handedly overnight just driven up people's energy bills, and we need to make that case again and again, you know, because that's what's at stake here. We know, but we just need to keep reminding people that energy bills are high because of our reliance on gas and on fossil fuels, not because of net zero. And there is so much evidence out there about the fact that it is those linkages to fossil fuels that's driving things up, not net zero. And in fact, the transition to net zero is far less expensive than most people think it is, and it's obviously it costs far less to get to net zero than it does to just do what Richard Tice would like to do, which is basically do nothing. And then you see the costs that you're going to get in terms of the impacts of more and more extreme weather, in terms of insurance companies saying they simply can't insure areas anymore. So we've got all of the arguments on our side. I think our real challenge is to make sure that we're communicating them in an effective and meaningful and simple way. And it's just really interesting, just, you know, by way of finishing, that in the meeting yesterday, I was just so struck that when we got to the question time yesterday with that panel, practically all the questions were about how do we communicate this stuff? How do we, given the fact that reform has relatively effectively toxified the debate, then how do we make this meaningful to people? And I think that is why we've put such a stress on getting your energy bills down, giving you more autonomy, making a real difference to your life now.
And Simon, from your perspective, to turn Sarah's question slightly, you obviously speak to members of parliament every day from every political party. How has reform's anti-clean energy agenda influenced the parties that you speak to on a daily basis? Is it a thing that you're coming across? Is it something that you think is a problem? So
I was thinking about this as the question came up and Caroline was speaking. I don't, maybe I'm being too optimistic, but I'm not sure it is, unless I've missed something completely. So I think some of the polling that we've done and various other things, the public seems to be behind this, sort of regardless of what Reform are saying. And I think as Carol mentioned, the energy bill stuff that's got massive cut through. As the polling showed, people do care about climate change and these issues. So I would perhaps not be as worried as others. I think is my slightly more positive take on that there.
And I think possibly it might even cause a bit of onus. Like this government needs to be impactful quickly, so it needs to get on and do it. Next question, please.
Sorry, if I just can say, I think making the distinction between Reform voters and Reform leaders is so important, which is basically what you two are both saying. But I think we can have more confidence when we're talking to the voters, because they're not voting Reform because of this. I think many of them are just voting Reform because they're just kind of fed up with the other options, which is a great shame and an indictment rather of our political system. But I think that's what's driving
Absolutely.
it.
And I think the U-turn from the Mayor of Humberside on clean energy investment is the first of hopefully many U-turns on the topic as well. Next question, please.
Interrupting, sorry, but I'm just noticing that Glenn Plant, who is an environmental lawyer, says that Tice has retreated from his position now, saying that Reform will not tolerate amendments to the CFT7 project. So even that thing that happened yesterday, which was alarming everybody, is now kind of seems to be stepped back. So thanks, Glenn, for that.
No problem. If we get the next question, please, Scott.
Very mad.
From Glenn Platt. How encouraged are you by yesterday's EC recommendation to MSSs to negotiate linking the ETSs, there's lots of acronyms here, and how discouraged by von der Leyen's environment downgrading in her 101% MFF budget proposals yesterday? Who wants to take that one first? Caroline?
No, I can do a quick start. So I think it's positive. It's taken a lot of effort from the EU to get to where they are before the summer recess, and that's certainly what they were aiming for, to have this done before the recess. So it shows they are taking it seriously and they are trying to reach an agreement quickly. And I mentioned before, CBAM comes in the 1st of January next year. So in an ideal world, we'd have them linked before that date. The UK government is pushing for some sort of interim agreement or some sort of workaround. If we're almost there, but we haven't quite dotted the I's, crossed the T's, can we avoid those CBAM charges while that's being negotiated? But yes, I think the fact that they've got to where they are before the recess is a positive sign. And as for the second point, this has been going on to a degree in the EU, certainly the last couple of months now. There has been sort of a pushback, from the more right, I would say, on the green agenda. And I think that's something our colleagues in the European Union have to do, and we have to guard against as well and push back against.
Yeah, absolutely, Caroline.
I just want to raise one issue, and Simon will correct me if I've got this wrong, but I think it's useful for people to know, in case people, when we're talking on the streets about this, in case people push back. So, as I understand it, there could be some short-term increases in energy bills as a result of bringing together the different ETSs, the different European emission trading systems, and emissions trading systems. That doesn't last for very long, not least because if we didn't do it, then we would be subject to the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is this thing that would basically levy a charge on all of our exports up to the cost of what the carbon price is in the EU. So the first thing, and I'm not explaining this terribly clearly, I'm afraid, but the first thing to say is that those energy costs that might be higher for a very short time would only be for a short time, because if we don't do it, then we're going to get hammered by the border adjustment. But the other thing to say is, and I was just really quite interested about this, and I wonder whether there's a scope for anything similar in the UK, is that the EU has set up this new social climate fund. And basically, it's been established under the auspices of emissions trading to help manage the social impacts of the transition to climate neutrality. And it will channel roughly 86 billion euros between 2026 and 2032. And that money is generated from revenues that come about by the auctioning of ETS allowances. Now, I know that our government is not terribly enthusiastic about hypothecation, in other words, in terms of ring fencing certain revenues towards certain purposes. But it did just make me interested in that wider discussion that's going on about the green transition and how you make sure that the green transition does not hurt some of the poorest communities or some of the workers who, if it happened in the way it did after the coal mines, for example, are just kind of thrown out of their jobs, and communities are literally still struggling now, 30 or 40 years later. So I think it is interesting that the EU is experimenting with things like this social climate fund. And it might be that in terms of the conversations that we have with people, that is a useful example to be able to put forward. Have I got that right, Simon?
Yes, no,
yeah, that was it.
Absolutely.
Sorry.
And actually, I think by having the social climate fund and other things, similar funding mechanisms, it helps maintain support for this agenda, doesn't it? Across the wider society. I think that's why it is important, I think.
Yeah.
And we were discussing, weren't we, when we were pulling together the report, Simon, when you were writing the report, that that is a political choice, and it's a political choice that we have to advocate for from our government if it meant increasing energy costs temporarily. And on von der Leyen's environment downgrading, I mean, ultimately, we are best placed as an organisation, aren't we? The European movement is best placed to advocate not just for an improvement in the UK's position on this, but actually also to work with our colleagues in EMI that work across, and all of the other European movements that work across the member states to drive up the standards and drive up this policy area in the EU as well. I want to try and get 2 more questions in if we can. So can we quickly do 2 quick questions, please, Scott? And Lawson Lucas. I'm concerned about pollution and bioplastics, a worldwide problem. Can UK-EU collaboration address this? Simon, do you want to start us off with this one?
I think the short answer is yes, absolutely, we can. This speaks to pillar 3 of the partnership in matching the EU standards where they've gone higher. So particularly, I think plastics and in rivers, I believe the EU has gone further and faster than the UK has. So if we were dynamically aligning with the EU, we would automatically raise our standards in this area because the EU is basically ahead of us.
Brilliant. And Caroline, anything to add to that?
Well, just very briefly, I guess that when we've got these global treaties that are hopefully being negotiated on reducing plastic pollution, then to be part of the EU means we've got greater clout when it comes to those global negotiations as well, because we're part of a much bigger bloc that, can have more effect than us just being there on our own.
And one final question, please, Scott. Will the reduction in voting age alter this? Very big question. Caroline, do you want to start?
I'm assuming that this in question is the our relation
as a
to
whole.
the EU.
Yeah.
Yeah. And yes, I think it will. I think this is quite exciting, I have to say. We know that younger people, by and large, are more pro-EU than older people, and we know that one of the reasons that more recent polling shows more people in favour of rejoining the EU, and more people thinking that leaving was a mistake, is partly due to demographics. It's not just that people have changed their minds, although some have. It is also that some of the older people who were pro-Brexit have sadly passed away. So we know that there is a real demographic issue here, and a particular view from younger people that being part of the European Union is a positive thing. So I wanted to end tonight's discussions on a high note, and this is one way of doing that. I think it will be really, really helpful.
Brilliant. And Simon?
Yeah, just quickly, not to that point, but just two quick points. Just to be clear, linking emissions trading systems and avoiding CBAM, the benefits will far outweigh any short-term problems. It's massively a net positive. And we didn't mention, we know the UK-EU summits are going to be every year now. So we expect the next one to be in May 2026 or around there. And we very much like to see, all or is part of what we're proposing in this partnership at the next summit. And that's hopefully what we'll be working towards.
Yeah, absolutely. And then very quickly on the reduction in voting age, certainly from my perspective, what would be very interesting is it is a voting group that's never been polled, because the polling companies are only ever interested in if if someone can vote or not. So I think it's going to be a really fascinating learning curve for a lot of us, to be honest with you. I think we're going to learn a lot from the announcements today. And as Caroline said, it's a really positive thing. I think that it will allow us to engage with a generation of people who are very politically engaged to a big degree on issues like this. But we need to make sure that we are presenting it in a way that is meaningful to them, that they feel that they can get involved in, and feel that it is something that they can use as a vehicle of change. So I just want to end, really, we've got a couple of minutes, on an enormous thank you to our speakers, to Caroline and Simon, who have worked incredibly hard over the last few days and weeks and months, quite honestly, to launch this campaign. We know that we have an immense amount of credibility with Caroline on this issue, and I want to thank her for all of the work that she does for us, for all of the work that she's done in the past, and all of the work that she will continue to do. And to Simon, who has pulled together a really groundbreaking piece of work for the European movement. It's something very, very tangible. It helps build on the work that we've done over the last 10 years since the decision to leave the European Union, and reinvent us as an important campaigning organisation with very clear policy asks that will ultimately be that step-by-step approach to earning our position right back at the heart of the European Union. And I think the one thing that I hope that you all take from this is that, yes, it is important to have these policy asks. Yes, it is important to engage with our members of parliament on this issue, and to remind them that this is a part of the wider impact of being a future member of the EU. But it is also something that is so important to get out there to everyone, to communities, to individuals, to voters, new and old. And I hope that with everything that we produce as part of this campaign, it will help you out in your communities to do that. So again, you will be able to see a QR code. Hopefully we'll be able to bring it back up. This is the QR code to scan to join that WhatsApp group. It will be where we do most of our coordination from. And this is just the start. This is the start of a campaign that we know that in that policy report that there is a lot of stretch asks of the government. But quite honestly, we play a very unique role in the work that we do, both lobbying the UK government and working with our colleagues in the EU to put pressure where we need to in order to progress this policy area. And again, you can see our link to the petition. Please do go sign that petition, share it on WhatsApp. WhatsApp shares create the largest amount of conversion. www.europeanmovement.co.uk/1_earth_1_team. And if there's one thing you do, please share it with 10 friends. Make sure that you introduce your friends to a campaign of the European movement, an organisation that they may not be aware of. So please do that. The more new people we get signed up to this campaign, the more people we can contact, the more people we can get involved in our campaigns, both at group level and nationally. And also read the report. It's a wonderful piece of work. Make sure that you digest it. By all means, make sure you get in touch with the team, ask questions about it, engage with it. As Caroline said, the landing page has a very plain language way to explain each of our pillars, and it's really important that we use that. But it's really important that you take that report, make sure your MP has it, make sure your MP responds to it. Do what you can to help us as a collective, as a royal we, to get this campaign up, running, and in the inboxes of everyone that needs it. So I will end the webinar with saying, again, an enormous thank you to Caroline and to Simon, and an even bigger thank you to you for taking part in this webinar, for being so engaging. And I'm really sorry that we couldn't get around to every one of the questions, but we will endeavour to make sure that we respond to you if you reach out. Thanks very much.